All right. Last time we met, we had finished up talking about the pons, right? Pons. So that brings us to this point to talk about the midbrain, or mesencephalon. So our last segment of the brainstem is the top of the brainstem, and the function of it, as you can see, includes several different things. Several functions, I should say, not just one function. So let's read through what it does. Anterior part of the midbrain contains paired bundles of axons, which we call cerebral peduncles, which are axons of motor tracts conducting nerve impulses from the cortex to our spinal cord, pons, and medulla. So basically describes that signals travel through the midbrain, coming down from the upper part of the brain, what we call the cerebral cortex, down to the spinal cord, pons, and medulla. So from the upper part of the brain to lower parts of the brain and down to the spinal cord. Obviously, pain is something that really sucks to have, but it's something that's very important, and that is one of the functions of our midbrain, being aware of our pain. Why is that important? Well, if we didn't ever have pain, we would never know if something was wrong with our body, like in the case of a hand on a hot stove. So that's important because it's going to help us try to get away from the painful stimulus if possible. Midbrain is going to function in visual attention, visually tracking moving objects, other visual reflexes like blinking, focusing, dilating and constricting our pupils, and turning our eyes and head in response to a visual stimulus are a result of the midbrain. It's also involved in auditory reflex, excuse me, like the stellar reflex, causing sudden movements of the head, eyes, and trunk caused by loud noises like a gunshot. Within the midbrain are red nuclei, sites of synapses between axons from the cerebellum and cerebral cortex, helping to control some voluntary movements of our limbs. Yes? Were you here on Friday? I have a stack of stuff from this class. Look through those, see if there's any in there. Cranial nerves 3 and 4 originate on the midbrain, so we'll talk about those at the end of this lecture. Within midbrain, we also have a region known as the substantia nigra. Several nuclei in the midbrain that releases dopamine, which we learned in our last lecture is involved in subconscious controlling our body movements. Loss of these neurons is associated with Parkinson's disease. We talked about Parkinson's the other day, that progressive disorder of the central nervous system, typically affecting its victims around the age of 60. In an individual with Parkinson's disease, involuntary skeletal muscle contractions interfere with voluntary movements. And this is what I was talking about the other day with Michael J. Fox. All right, our next structure, a very singular structure that was visible in that figure of the brain that I showed on Friday. Because this is a small cluster of gray matter kind of sprinkled in within white matter of our brainstem, as well as certain regions of the spinal cord, diencephalon, and cerebellum. So you kind of find the reticular formation kind of all over the place. The major part that we focus on in this class is the reticular activating system, or RAS, consisting of sensory axons that project to the cerebral cortex. The RAS does a lot of things, as you can see here on the next page. Possibly the most important function of it is consciousness. Hopefully this is something that is being utilized by you guys right now. Consciousness is defined as a state of wakefulness in which an individual is fully alert, aware, and oriented. If you inactivate the RAS, it produces sleep. We all love sleep and appreciate sleep. This is a state of partial consciousness from which an individual can be aroused, which the RAS is involved with waking up from sleep, what we call arousal. Now, the difference between sleep and a coma is that sleep, you can be aroused. You can shake and slap and do anything that you want to a person in a coma. They're not going to wake up more than likely, at least until, something happens. Sometimes it can be several years. Sometimes it never happens. A coma can result from damage to the RAS. Okay. The RAS helps maintain attention, which is the concentration on a single object or thought, or alertness. It also comes from the RAS. Prevents sensory overload by filtering out unimportant sensory information. This is something that I always like to talk about. In this class, we are right next to the one major really road here in Highland, which is utilized by tractors and combines and semi-trucks. Well, there are a lot of times when a tractor or semi will drive by as I'm teaching. It happened, I think, last spring perfectly. I was talking about this stuff, and a big old semi came barreling through. And then I asked everybody how many people heard the semi, and nobody raised their hand, which made me feel really good because they were so alert and focused on me. But it was illustrating that we can sometimes filter out unimportant stuff. My wife seems to think I do this way too much to the stuff that she says, but that's okay. RAS helps maintain muscle tone, which is a slight degree of involuntary contraction in normal resting skeletal muscles. I talked about that today. And the RAS also helps regulate some of our visceral motor muscles, so muscles within our viscera, internal organs. Like I said, you don't find the RAS in just kind of one area. It's kind of sprinkled in within a variety of places. That includes parts of the brainstem, parts up here in the thalamus, hypothalamus area, and even within the cerebellum. And it kind of has connections to all sorts of different places in our brain. All right, our next structure is the second largest part of our brain and is the largest part of our hindbrain, and it is known as the cerebellum. Now, we haven't talked about the cerebrum yet, but the cerebellum and the cerebrum are structured very similarly. There's a highly folded surface that makes up the outer part of the cerebellum, just like in the cerebrum. This surface that is folded in on itself greatly increases the surface area of outer gray matter cortex, which means that there is a large number of neurons. So even though our cerebellum only consists of a tenth of our brain mass, nearly half of the neurons in our brain are located here. So pretty neat. Lies posterior to the medulla and pons and inferior to the posterior portion of the cerebrum. Deep groove known as transverse fissure along with the tentorium cerebelli separates it from the cerebrum. That's really not important physiologically more than what we really focus on in here because that's just anatomical stuff. It does consist, just like the cerebrum does, of two hemispheres. This time we call them cerebellar instead of cerebral hemispheres. There's a bridge that connects them called the vermis. Kind of looks like a little worm. You can take those hemispheres and you can break them down into smaller lobes. There's an anterior and posterior lobe that governs subconscious aspects of skeletal muscle movements. That, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. F lobe on the inferior surface contributes to equilibrium and balance. So overall, really, the cerebellum helps to coordinate movement and is involved with equilibrium and balance. The key to understanding what it does is to know that it does not initiate signals that cause us to move. Okay, it's basically just kind of making sure things are happening correctly. Okay. And that's visible here with the very last bullet, which states the primary function of the cerebellum is to evaluate how well movements initiated by motor areas in the cerebrum are actually being carried out. That's something I would put a big old fat star or highlight on. And the rest of the stuff really is anatomical discussion. As I mentioned, the outer surface of gray matter is called the cerebellar cortex. The folds are called folia. There is white matter within the gray matter, what we call the arbor vitae, which for those of you who've taken anatomy have got to see that both in picture form and in lab when we dissected the sheep brains. You guys remember what arbor vitae translates to mean? Tree of life. Good. And then even more gray matter is found within the arbor vitae called deep cerebellar nuclei. They give rise to axons that carry impulses from the cerebellum to other brain centers. But overall, the last thing is the major thing I want you to know about the cerebellum and its role in coordinating movement. On this page, explains how we have these structures called cerebellar peduncles that connect the cerebellum to the brainstem. This is white matter bundles that conduct impulses between the cerebellum and other parts of the brain that help to coordinate that movement and posture. You can kind of read through them. There's a lot of anatomy stuff in there. I'm not really too worried about you knowing, but you can kind of see how the cerebellum is connected to different things. All right, moving up from the lower parts of the brain, we're going to now talk about the thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. We're all part of that diencephalon that we learned about the other day. Each side of our brain has a thalamus. Looks kind of like an egg, so it's an oval shape of gray matter. The nickname for it is the gateway to the cerebral cortex. It's something that is important because that describes its major function, which is this first bullet. It is the major relay station for most sensory impulses reaching the primary sensory areas of the cerebral cortex from the spinal cord and brainstem. Basically, what that means is when signals travel up from our various receptors and do so by way of the spinal nerves and cranial nerves, and then travel up from the spinal cord or through the brainstem, before they reach the cortex where we process that and integrate it, there's going to be a synapse occurring within the thalamus. So when you have an itch, when you have a tickle, when you feel pain or pressure, when you are processing what you're seeing or hearing, more than likely those signals before they reach the cortex, where we really process that information, is traveling to the thalamus first. Okay. We actually saw that illustration back in our last lecture when we saw the many steps that were involved in just holding and writing with a pencil. We saw the sensory stuff going up from the hand into the spinal cord, traveling through the brainstem, and then they went to this thalamus. And then from there, the short distance to the cortex. So signals travel through the thalamus before the cortex for most of our sensory information. Now, that was sensory, but the thalamus also functions in motor aspect of our body by transmitting information from the cerebellum and basal ganglia to the primary motor area of the cerebral cortex. So that kind of just also illustrates that it's a highway for signals up to the cortex. Okay. It relays nerve impulses between different areas of the cerebrum. Plays a role in the maintenance of consciousness, which we talked about earlier today. And several groups of nuclei are located on the sides of the thalamus, functioning in emotions, memory, learning, cognition, sensory information, auditory impulses, visual impulses, arousal, and olfaction. Okay. I imagine you guys all know what auditory, that's hearing, visual, that's seeing. What about olfaction? Anyone know what that fancy word describes? It's a fancy word to describe the sense of smell. And so we'll talk about this. And we'll actually come back and talk a little bit more about the thalamus when we talk about emotions and that kind of stuff, because there's a group of things called the limbic system that it's involved with. All right, hypothalamus is the next structure. First sentence really there describes its anatomical structure and where it's at. Forms the wall of the floor of the third ventricle. Third ventricle is a region within the brain where we find that cerebrospinal fluid. Talked about that last week. What is important in this class, physiologically, is its various functions. And this does so many things. Okay. It is the major control center of our autonomic nervous system and our endocrine system, which, remember, the endocrine system uses hormones. What did I tell you guys to remember for autonomic? Control that was done automatically, right? So you can pretty much assume if something's happening in our body automatically, the hypothalamus is in charge of it. And it's also the main regulator of the endocrine system. Remember, the nervous system and the endocrine system are the two major systems in charge of everything, right? So the hypothalamus can basically be thought of as the boss of just about everything. Yeah. So it's very important. The last thing there is really anatomy stuff, so I'm not really going to focus on it. But I definitely want to talk about the various functions that it performs. This is very, very diverse in what it does. First thing, since it's the major regulator of the endocrine system, it should make sense that it is going to release hormones, because that's what the endocrine system does. It secretes hormones that control the anterior pituitary gland, doing things like regulating growth, metabolism, reproduction, and our response to stress. It also produces hormones that are carried from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary that is then going to release them. We talked about childbirth in females and a hormone called oxytocin. That's part of a positive feedback loop. Oxytocin is a hormone that's produced by the hypothalamus and released by the posterior pituitary. There's also antidiuretic hormone. These things are going to be discussed in much more great detail in our next unit when we actually get into the endocrine system. As I said on the previous page, the hypothalamus is the major control center of the autonomic nervous system. So you can see bullet 2, autonomic effects. So it sends signals that influence heart rate, blood pressure, gastrointestinal secretion, motility, among many other things. Now, the other day we learned that within our medulla, we had the cardiac center that regulated heart rate. We also had the vasomotor center that regulated blood pressure. So the medulla is in charge of those things. Guess who's in charge of the medulla? Hypothalamus. Okay. So it can be traced back to this structure. Your thermostat of your body is found within your hypothalamus. I've talked about shivering and sweating since the beginning of the semester. Well, who controls whether we shiver or when we sweat? Your hypothalamus. Okay. It is your hunger and thirst center. Okay, so it controls food and water intake. Does so by monitoring blood glucose or blood sugar, amino acid levels. If those are low, it should produce a sensation of hunger. If we are full of food, it should provide us with a sensation of satiety, the satisfaction of appetite. Also monitors osmolarity of the blood, which is basically just your water balance. Can stimulate us to be thirsty when we're dehydrated. It helps us set our circadian rhythms, therefore setting our sleep-wake cycle. Okay. It basically explains why some people are night owls like my wife, who I love to death, and why some people like myself are more of the early bird gets the worm type. And it's all related to your hypothalamus. Memory is involved with the hypothalamus. It is part of the signaling pathway from the hippocampus, which we'll talk more about, an important memory center of the brain on its way to the thalamus. And then it's very involved with emotional behavior, things like anger, aggression, fear, pleasure, contentment, sexual drive, and orgasm. And so, a lot to digest here for the hypothalamus. Last structure of the diencephalon is the epithalamus. Which includes a gland called the pineal gland. This is kind of a major structure of the epithalamus. Pineal gland produces melatonin. Melatonin is the chemical that causes us to fall asleep. This is our own natural sleep aid. Okay, we produce more of it at night, which is why we want to sleep at night. Okay, this is the direct structure that controls our biological clock, circadian rhythm. Now, when I say biological clock, you hear that term a lot of times described like when you should have a baby and that kind of stuff. It's not what we're talking about. This is talking about when it's nighttime and you're starting to feel sleepy, so you go to sleep, and then when you wake up. And some people out there, myself included, don't even need an alarm clock because they're going to wake up at the same time every day. Okay, it relates to your release of melatonin. You don't want to confuse melatonin with melanin, which is where your skin color, your hair color, your eye color come from. That's a pigment. Melatonin is a hormone that causes us to fall asleep. You can actually get melatonin over the counter. Okay, it's a way of helping yourself sleep if you can't. It's something that's useful, especially like if you're jet lagged or something like that. And like I said, pineal gland is the main structure of the hypothalamus. All right, that leaves us with one last structure of the brain, which is the largest, making up 80% of our brain, and that is the cerebrum. This is where our highest level processing functioning comes from. And this is what really separates us from other animals. We have the largest kind of per body foot square inch and that gives us the highest level thinking. It gives us the ability to write, to read, to speak, make calculations, compose music, remember the past, plan for the future, imagine things that have never existed before. Just like the cerebellum, it consists of two halves. This time we call them cerebral hemispheres. There's a left and right. And since the cerebrum is so large, we divide it into 4 lobes, named for the bones that overlie them. That includes a frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobe. And that's per hemisphere. So there are 2 frontal lobes, 2 temporal lobes, 2 parietals, 2 occipitals. Okay. The outside surface of the cerebrum is called the cerebral cortex, and that's really where that magical brain power comes from. It's only 2 to 4 millimeters thick, okay, but it's folded in on itself, with the folds being known as gyri that help to increase its surface area. There are deep grooves and shallow grooves called fissures and sulci that help to divide the cerebrum into various parts. Okay. There's a 5th part of the cerebrum that can only be seen if you dissect the brain, called the insula. That is deep within those other lobes. Okay. Now, I'm not super concerned with these prominent fissures and sulci of the cerebrum, because most of this is anatomy. But I do like to talk a little bit mainly about the central sulcus, because it's the divider that exists between the frontal and parietal lobes. And why that's important is because in front of it, in what we call the precentral gyrus, something very important happens, and then something right behind it, called the postcentral gyrus, happens. That's very important to us. Okay. The precentral gyrus is going to contain association or interneurons that we call upper motor neurons. This is the part of our brain that sends signals down, causing voluntary skeletal muscle contractions. So when I'm waving my right hand, remember, crossing over takes place in the medulla. So that signal's coming from my precentral gyrus of my left hemisphere. The postcentral gyrus is where our somatosthetic sensations are processed. Somatosthetic sensations are sensations that arise in our skin, muscles, tendons, and joints. So cold and pain and pressure, itch and tickle, stretch of the muscle, tension of the muscle, those are all traveling up to this postcentral gyrus. The other fissures and sulci just kind of help divide the brain into its various parts. Longitudinal fissure divides it into the 2 hemispheres. Lateral fissure is between the temporal lobe between the frontal and parietal lobes above, and then parietal occipitals, obviously based on its name, between the parietal and occipital lobes. Those things are all labeled here in this image that's showing you the different parts of the cerebrum. Not that I'm really concerned with it because this is, anatomy-based stuff, but I do always like to show that these folds called gyri is the plural form for gyrus, help to increase the amount of gray matter or cerebral cortex that we have. Okay. Speaking of cerebral cortex, some doctors and scientists, very, very smart doctors and scientists, were able to kind of figure out where things happen in our cortex and have named several what we call functional areas. Okay. I'm not going to be worried about their location, which can be illustrated here on this next page, but I do want you to know what these functional areas represent. As I mentioned, the primary somatosensory area found in the post central gyrus receives nerve impulses for touch, pressure, vibration, itch, tickle, temperature, pain, and proprioception. Our primary visual area receives visual info and is involved with visual perception, processing what you see right now on the board. Right now you are using your primary auditory as well, which receives info for sound, is involved in auditory perception. Primary gustatory area, gestation is the fancy way to describe taste. So the gustatory area receives impulses for taste and is involved with taste or gustatory perception. Primary olfactory area, we said olfactory or olfaction refers to smell. So this receives impulses for smell, is involved in olfactory perception, so perceiving what we smell. Primary motor area, like I said, is in that prefrontal gyrus. That is going to control voluntary contractions of specific muscles or muscle groups. We've got a couple of special ones. Broca's speech area is a special one. It's involved in the articulation of speech. So it helps you articulate your speech, found most often in the left hemisphere. Wernicke's area should be active in you guys right now. Interprets the meaning of speech by recognizing spoken words. Your facial recognition area is pretty cool. It allows you to store information about faces, allow you to recognize people by their faces. If you get damaged to this, it's pretty crazy, but you won't recognize people. Auditory association area allows you to recognize particular sound of speech, music, or noise. Hopefully this one's active in you guys right now, listening to me talk instead of listening to me sing or just hearing the wah, 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 like on Charlie Brown. And then the prefrontal cortex is found at the front of your brain and the frontal lobes, and gives us our personality, intellect, complex learning abilities, the recalling of information, initiative, judgment, foresight, reasoning, conscience, intuition, mood, planning for the future, and development of abstract ideas. Okay, you probably, if you've taken psychology, probably learned about some of these, probably especially the prefrontal cortex. Unfortunately, the location of the prefrontal cortex puts it at risk for damage, since it's right here in your forehead, and you can have like a accident in a car and hit your head on the steering wheel. You can damage that, and it's been known that damage to the prefrontal cortex will alter somebody's personality and that kind of stuff, where you hear about the person being like the nicest person ever before, and then after being just a big old butthead. Like I said, you don't need to really worry about their location, and those are all labeled here in this image, but I do want you to know what those functional areas are. I only chose a few, really. There are several more. Okay, as you can see, some of those, like orbitofrontal cortex, we didn't even talk about. The premotor cortex I didn't talk about, but I did talk about the motor cortex. So I've taken it somewhat easy on you, at least. So that was all gray matter. And that was all the very outermost part of the cerebrum, but there's still a lot of other stuff to go. Since the cerebrum is so large, well, there's going to be a lot of white matter, as we learned the other day, white matter in the brain, specifically this part of the brain. is deep to the outer gray matter. And just like in our spinal cord, the white matter in our brain is organized into tracts. Myelinated axons that connect the cerebral hemispheres, connect the gyri within the hemispheres, or connect the cerebrum to the spinal cord. We classify the tracts into three types. Projection tracts are like those tracts in our spinal cord and brain, or spinal cord, excuse me. They extend vertically between higher and lower brain and spinal cord centers, carrying information up and down. So from the cerebrum to lower parts of the CNS, like the thalamus, brainstem, and spinal cord, or up from the lower parts of the CNS to the cerebrum. So these are kind of like those ascending, descending tracts we talked about the other day that our spinal cord has. Our cerebrum also has what we call commissural tracts. Commissural tracts form a structure called the corpus callosum, which allows for signals to travel from one hemisphere to the other. Okay. If you've taken anatomy, you probably, hopefully remember the thing called this corpus callosum. Kind of looks like a C if you turn your page, which is nice because corpus begins with C, so does callosum, and so does commissural, which is what the tracts are that form these. The last type of tracts are called association tracts, which just allow signals to travel forward and backward within the same hemisphere. So that's why we can only see them in this sagittal section. If you look down here at the bottom with these green projection tracts, look down here at the medulla, specifically the pyramids, illustrating that decussation. What was decussation a fancy word to describe? Crossing over. Remember how our left brain controls our right body and vice versa. Okay. And that's because of these projection tracts. All right, that was the white matter. Now we can see some more gray matter down deeper within the cerebral hemisphere. This is collectively known as basal nuclei. The old term to describe it was basal ganglia. Well, ganglia is a term that refers to the peripheral nervous system, whereas nuclei refers to the central nervous system. So they've changed it from basal ganglia to basal nuclei. I put ganglia in parentheses just because sometimes you'll still see it that way. Okay, there are three structures that make up the basal nuclei. I'm not really worried about that. But the main functions of it are, and you can see I still have basal ganglia written, initiates, terminates movements, suppresses unwanted movements, and regulates muscle tone. Okay, that's really what I want you to know about the basal nuclei. Very last bullet. All right, I've already alluded to this series of structures, a set of structures, what we call the limbic system. A ring of cerebral cortex on the inner border of the cerebrum and floor of the diencephalon. Includes a whole bunch of different things. Some of them we've already mentioned, like the thalamus, the mammillary bodies, which are actually kind of associated with the hypothalamus. I've already mentioned the word hippocampus, but it also includes a cingulate gyrus, dentate gyrus, amygdala, olfactory bulb. Not that I'm super concerned with knowing the various parts, but I do want you to know that its nickname is our emotional brain because it governs emotional aspects of our behavior, things like pleasure, pain, docility, affection, fear, and anger. This is what really drives your lower animals, like if you have a dog or a cat, their whole life is centered around pleasure, avoiding pain. Does your dog plan for the future, compose music, sit in a classroom and listen to their instructor ramble on to promote their further education? No. Okay. They're always just about getting dog treats and having their belly rubbed and that kind of stuff. And so the limbic system is kind of the more important part of the brain for those types of animals. We are not regulated by our limbic system. Hopefully, we let our cortex do a lot of our lifestyle and life decisions. The limbic system is also involved in olfaction or smell. Remember, olfaction and smell mean the same thing, as well as memory. And then the hippocampus, along with the cerebrum, helps to function in memory. Now, this is a concept that's actually being kind of taken away. Not taken away because it's, being removed. But we're finding out that it is probably not as prominent as we once thought and might not actually even exist. So I know if you take psychology, there's a good chance that they won't talk about this. Or they might mention that it doesn't, they don't think it's really what occurs. This textbook does teach it this way, so I am going to include it. This concept is called hemispheric lateralization, which describes the fact that our two hemispheres are distinctly different in what they do. Okay? Even though they are almost symmetrical anatomically, they function independently in certain things. On the right side of the hemisphere, or the right side of the brain, the right hemisphere does a lot of more artistic, musical type things. You can see, kind of read through those. If you've ever heard somebody describing themselves or describing somebody else as being right-brained or left-brained, this is what they're talking about. Okay. I'm definitely not right-brained if that's what exists. I fall more left hemisphere, which is why I'm a science teacher. Numerical, scientific skills, reasoning, that kind of stuff. I do want you to know those various functions. So I might ask on the test questions, which of the following is a right hemisphere function, which of the following is a left hemispheric function. So you're going to want to know the table. I know yours might be a little bit small. You can always pull it up online if you can't read it, or it's in your textbook in chapter 14. The very last thing I want to talk about in this lecture are those cranial nerves that originate from or terminate in the brain. Even though this lecture is titled Central Nervous System, these cranial nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system, but I included them because they are so tied in with the central nervous system. Since we've been talking about the brain, it made sense to go ahead and talk about them. They are in pairs, and there are 12 of them, so there's 24 total. They're numbered using Roman numerals from anterior to posterior, so 1 is the anterior-most, and 12 would be the posterior-most. We've already talked about how some of the various things like our medulla and pons are associated with them. We classify them as one of 3 types. Those that are predominantly or only containing sensory neurons. That includes 1, 2, and 7. Olfactory, optic, and vestibular and cochlear nerves are all sensory. Motor means that they contain or predominantly contain motor neurons, which means that their signals are going out from the brain. There are 3, 4, 6, 11, and 12 that fall into that category. And then there are 4 trigeminal, facial, glossopharyngeal, vagus that are mixed, containing both sensory and motor neurons. We've mentioned spinal nerves. Spinal nerves are always going to be mixed. So cranial nerves are unique in that some of them are sensory, motor, or mixed. Okay. Here on this next page, table 8.1 is a table that gives you the number, the name, the type, and the functions. I want you to know this table for sure. Okay. What's listed here for most of them is pretty general as far as their function goes. We won't get into all of them throughout this semester. So on these last 2 slides, I believe it's 2 slides, I kind of talk a little bit about the ones that we talk about the most. Just because these are the ones that we're going to really emphasize in this class for various reasons. The first 2 listed here are the first 2, the optic and olfactories. Optics are cranial nerves 2, olfactory cranial nerves 1. Why are we talking about these? Because of our special senses and their role in processing 2 of our 5 special senses. The olfactory nerves are entirely sensory nerves containing axons conducting nerve impulses for olfaction. What's olfaction again? Smell, thank you. Optic is always going to refer to eye, so this is the 2 cranial nerves. And these actually insert into your eyeball directly. And so when we talk about vision, which is what they do, we'll talk about the optic nerves. Something pretty cool about these guys is they're like what happens in our medulla. And what I mean is they perform crossing over. That place where these 2 nerves come together is called the optic chiasm. They actually crisscross. What's crazy about our vision, and vision I would say is definitely the most complex of our special senses, is not all of what we see with each eyeball crosses over. Okay, so you see some stuff with your right eyeball that's processed in your left brain. Some of what you see in your right eyeball, though, is processed in your right brain. So some stuff crosses over, but not everything. It just depends on which part of the retina that we're striking. As it states, converges about 10 millimeters posterior to the eyeball. Axons from the medial half of each eye cross to the opposite side, while axons from the lateral half remain on that same side. So if you were to kind of divide your eyeball from front to back into left and right sides, the side closest to your ears is going to stay on that side. The side closest to your nose is going to crisscross. Vestibular cochlear nerves are important nerves because they actually are involved with 2 of our special senses, which includes our sense of hearing and then the sense of balance, or audition and equilibrium. It's another one of those, or they are another one of those sensory-only nerves. The vagus nerve is what's going to really be talked about in our next lecture. The word Vegas in this case, not like Las Vegas, but this word translates to mean wandering. This is the longest of the cranial nerves. It actually distributes down from our head, through our neck, into the thorax, and even down into our abdomen. Pretty significantly long nerve. Now, it is mixed, so it does have sensory aspect of function. So as it reads there, sensory axons in the vagus nerve arise from the skin of the external ear, a few taste buds, proprioceptors or stretch receptors in the muscles of the neck and throat, baroreceptors or stretch receptors in the arch of the aorta, chemoreceptors in the aortic body, visceral sensory receptors in most visceral organs of the thoracic and abdominal cavity. We will talk about those things a little bit, but really what we talk about in our next lecture is its role in motor function. This is your major output for the parasympathetic nervous system, which we know the parasympathetic nervous system provides us with that rest and digest response, right? So it sends signals that help us to relax and have a resting heart rate and blood pressure, breathing rate, that kind of stuff. And as you can kind of read through there, basically just describe that stuff. All right, we do have 5 minutes, so